This is the story of Qantas Flight 1. Safety is something that all airlines pride themselves on. Sure, flying is safer than driving, but flying evokes a sense of fear in some people that few other modes of transportation do. With all other modes of transportation, you have the ground beneath your feet, but not with air travel. Qantas is proud of its safety record. The airline hasn't lost a plane since the advent of the jet age, but on the 23rd of September 1999, that safety streak nearly came to an end. Qantas Flight 1 was a flight between Sydney and London with a stopover at Thailand's Don Mueang International Airport. As the plane approached Don Mueang, it was about 10 p.m. local time, and storms were brewing over the city. As rain beat down on the airport, the first officer was in control of Flight 1. As the plane approached the airport, visibility started to become an issue. Visibility was measured to be 1,500 meters or about 5,000 feet. Another Qantas plane, Flight 15, was approaching the airport, and they had to go around. As the plane made its way down to the runway, the plane was battered by the rain, blinding the pilots when they were at about 200 feet. But the plane was now a bit above where it should be. When crossing the runway threshold, it was at 76 feet, when it should have been at 44 feet. By the time they were 10 feet above the runway, the captain called for a go-around. The first officer advanced the throttles, but the plane's main landing gears still touched down on the runway. When the plane touched down, the captain had a change of heart and decided to continue with the landing, and he pulled the throttles back without verbalizing his intentions. But despite being on the runway, the plane was not slowing down as expected. Due to the plane being high on approach, the plane touched down a kilometer or 3,200 feet down the runway, and now it was going too fast. The plane was halfway down the runway, and it still hadn't slowed down to below its touchdown speed. It was too late now. There just wasn't enough runway for the plane to stop. The plane overran the runway at about 88 knots and went through an overrun area and came to stop near a perimeter road. The nose gear was broken, the engines were busted up, but all on board survived. All of the 410 people on board made it out safely. The story of how a massive 747 overran the runway starts before it even got on the runway. During the approach, the pilots assessed the runway conditions and set the auto brake system to level 3 to account for the wet runway. At this point, the weather was relatively good. They could see the airport, and rain was not that much of an issue, but they could see storm cells over the airport. Before they were transferred to the tower at Don Mueang, another Qantas plane went around due to the weather. The crew of Flight 1 were not told about this, and they were on another frequency at this time. They thought that the plane right in front of them had landed, and this gave them the confidence to continue with the approach. Had they known that another plane had gone around, then they might have gone around themselves. The last plane that landed had reported that braking action on the runway was good. This further compelled the pilots to go ahead with the approach. The plane was all set to land, and the pilots had configured the plane according to Qantas's Flaps 25 idle reverse thrust procedure. But first, water flaps. Flaps help a plane to maintain lift at low speeds. The more you extend the flaps, the more lift you have. For this procedure, the pilots had to set the flaps to 25. Flaps 25 is not the maximum flap setting. It can extend quite a bit more. This meant that at flaps 25, you'd have to fly the approach at a higher speed to maintain lift. Also, once on the ground, this procedure called for the minimal use of reverse thrust. So why was this the approved procedure? The procedure was adopted to reduce brake maintenance and thrust reverser maintenance. This procedure also reduced the noise in and around Sydney Airport. Thus, this was the standard approach procedure at Qantas. Had the pilots used full flaps and full reversers, they would have flown the approach at a much lower speed, and they might not have overran the runway. Thanks to this and some bad weather, the plane was high and fast as it crossed the runway threshold, but still within the company limits. Soon the plane was just 10 feet away from the runway, and the captain was not confident in this landing. His reasoning was that he could no longer see the end of the runway, and the plane still had not touched down. The first officer, upon hearing the go-around call, pushed the throttles forward to initiate the go-around. As the engine spooled up, the wheels contacted the runway. They were down on the ground. At this point, the rain let up, and the captain could see the end of the runway, and he knew that the plane could stop in the runway that they had left, and so he decided to continue with the landing. His reasoning made sense. They still had runway left, and the engines were only spooling up. They weren't at max power. At this point, both pilots had their hands on the throttles, and the captain pulled the throttles back to continue the landing. The captain never verbalized his intentions. It is the captain's decision, but he has to say what he wants to do out loud so both pilots are on the same page. But an even bigger mistake was made. When the captain pulled the throttles back, neither one of their hands was in contact with the throttle of engine number 1 or the leftmost engine. That engine remained at a high power setting. On the CVR, they heard the sounds of throttles 2, 3, and 4 hitting the idle stops, but not engine number 1. Seconds later, the first officer pulled power back on engine number 1 as well. The plane at this point was going 160 knots on the runway. Once the throttle for engine number 1 was pulled back to idle, the spoilers deployed, and things seemed to be getting back on track. But one small thing in the cockpit had changed. Remember how the pilot set the auto brake system during the approach? The auto brake system, as the name suggests, applies the brakes automatically. But before the computer commanded a brake activation, a few conditions had to be satisfied. One of them being that all 4 throttles were at idle. But as we know, one of the throttles wasn't at idle. This meant that the auto brake system disarmed itself, and that meant that the pilots would have to brake manually. So as the 747 barreled down the runway, the pilots were waiting for the brakes to kick in automatically. So let's take stock of the situation right now. We have a 747 that's coming in high and fast, albeit not by much. The plane floated down the runway for quite some time and touched down really late. The captain called for a go-around and then called it off because of his experience that told him that the plane had enough runway left. This rejected go-around left one engine at a relatively high thrust setting, and that disabled the auto brakes on the plane. On top of all of this, the pilots were not going to use reverse thrust in any meaningful way during the landing, as that was the procedure at Qantas. Quite the perfect storm, but not all's lost. The plane could still stop. The plane was halfway down runway 21 left at Don Mueang, and the plane's speed began to dip below its touchdown speed for the first time. The first officer saw that the plane wasn't slowing down as much as it should, so he started to apply manual braking in an attempt to slow the plane down. The plane's speed dropped to 133 knots, and the plane only had a kilometer or 3,200 feet of runway left. Now, the last part of the puzzle came into play. When the Thai A330 landed, they reported good braking action. This is what the crew were expecting as well. But between the landing of the A330 and Qantas Flight 1, rain battered the airport, and this led to water pooling on the ungrooved runway. So, when the first officer finally started braking, the plane started aquaplaning. The water acted as a lubricant between the wheels and the runway, and the braking action of the plane was reduced drastically. Now, the fate of Flight 1 was sealed. They just did not have the runway to stop. With any other airline, the airline would have been like, you know what, let's write this plane off and talk to the insurance people. But Qantas couldn't say that. They had not lost a plane since the advent of the jet age. They were obviously very proud of this fact. I mean, can your national airline claim that? Seriously though, what are a few airlines that can claim that they have not lost a jet aircraft? I can think of Hawaiian and Ryanair. Who else? But getting back to the story. Qantas decided to fix this badly damaged plane up. The landing gear was messed up. The engines were messed up. It was going to be costly, but their reputation was at stake. So they pumped $100 million into this plane to fix it up. Just for some context, you could get a brand new Boeing 747 at that time for $200 million. They fixed the plane up, and then it went on to fly for Qantas till 2012. This is an accident that was a perfect storm, literally and figuratively. Had something gone differently, all of this could have been avoided. Today, Qantas is one of the safest airlines out there. I guess for once someone learned their lesson. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.